should not look at it, think about it as something that just has arrived and it's done. It's not, there's no way of sort of pinpointing it and saying, aha, now we're in a global age, everything's sort of fixed, settled. In fact, the effects of this are extremely uneven and continue to be debated and battled about on an ongoing basis. Anybody who follows World Trade Organization negotiations, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade has been going on and on. They meet periodically. They always say that they're on the brink of some great breakthrough, but frequently the talks break down, and there are countless exceptions, special considerations, unevennesses in this process of globalization. One of the biggest battles being about agricultural subsidies, right? The ways in which the United States and many European countries continue to subsidize their farmers, even though the rules of the WTO would say that that's not allowed anymore. And there's plenty of lingering sort of protectionist impulses informing these kinds of debates and difficulties. Okay, now, let's turn to neoliberalism. This is another term that you probably encountered. It's already come up in one of the slides up here today. It's an extremely slippery term or concept. Anybody confused about why neoliberalism frequently seems like conservatism? Or rather, well, there's neoliberalism, there's also neoconservatism, right? And one of the weird things about these two terms is that they seem frequently to have the same content or very similar content. Any ideas why that would be? I mean, they're supposed to be opposites, right? Liberal, conservative, we consider them to be politically opposed most of the time. Why should adding NEO to the beginning of them somehow make them the same? Anyone know? Yeah. Okay, exactly. At its origins, and over its history in the last, say, 200 to 300 years, liberalism was associated with freedom of the market. It wasn't only about freedom of the market, but it was very much about freedom of the market. Adam Smith is a classic proponent of classic liberalism, and it included the idea that people should be free to produce the things they want, work for whomever they want, sell their labor. It included the idea that everyone is fundamentally equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of shopping or whatever, right? So it was a political philosophy as well. But in the economic realm, liberalism in its classical expressions was also about economic freedom. Remember Marx's line about Bentham, right? Utilitarianism. Those were ideas that were very, very central to liberalism. In the course of the 20th century, liberalism took on a different connotation in the United States and in much of Europe as well, associated with a stronger role for government, programs to sort of shore up the inequalities created by the market, things like Social Security, welfare, even public education. A heavy or strong or important role for the government came to be associated with liberalism, and that's why we now need, or the folks who espouse neoliberalism, call it neoliberalism, because they're in fact turning away from that more Keynesian 20th century welfare state notion of liberalism and re-articulating a philosophy grounded in economic free trade, freedom of the marketplace, that sort of more classically Adam Smithian, and, well, there's a whole bunch of other figures in the 20th century who inspire this. And it happens that those positions are positions that, again, in the course of the 20th century came to be associated with conservatism in the United States, hence the possibility that these two terms can come to resemble each other. Is that clear enough for present purposes? All right. To get at this question of neoliberalism, I'm drawing heavily on a book by David Harvey called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. He writes there, neoliberalism is, in the first instance, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. So that's a fairly straightforward summation of what we've just been discussing. He goes on, it holds that the social good will be maximized by maximizing the reach and frequency of market transactions, and it seeks to bring all human action into the domain of the market. This requires technologies of information creation and capacities to accumulate, store, transfer, analyze, and use massive databases to guide decisions in the global marketplace. So here we see the link to globalization articulated very much in terms of technology, but not technology just in the sense of new tools or new machines that can do things. Here it's linked to a specific purpose. What Harvey is pointing out is that in order for a global market to work, requires an incredible amount of information. And this is information that can only be effectively used for this purpose if it has a certain technological platform on which to operate. So if you put yourself, again, in the position of that firm deciding where to locate its factory. Should we locate it in Mexico? Should we locate it in Jamaica? Should we put it in the Philippines instead? That firm can't make those decisions without reliable information about all of those different locations. It has to be information they can count on. I mean, they're talking about investing millions of dollars, moving all kinds of equipment and employees to different parts of the world. They need to know what the situation is. And they need to be able to predict as best they can what the situation will look like in the future. If we make a widget in the Maquila zone in Mexico and we put $20 million into a factory there, what are the prices of goods going to be? The supply pieces, the inputs, the labor. What are the circumstances for the market for the widgets? What are prices for widgets going to look like there? Where are we going to send them? Who's going to buy them? Harvey's suggesting that in order for there to be such a thing as a free market that functions effectively in the way that markets are supposed to function according to the theory, it has to have, it presupposes an incredible supply of information that has to be accurate, reliable, and you have to be able to actually process it. You have to be able to analyze it. You just have a huge amount of information sitting around, but you have no way of actually synthesizing it and asking it questions and coming back with answers. And that's all things made possible by computers. And you have to have the ability to create new information, move it around. You have to be able to find out what the price of some good is on the other side of the world in effectively real time. And these are things made possible by computers that were really very much more difficult before. We've seen this again in movies. The movement of price signals about coffee between Paris or London or New York and the highlands of Ethiopia. How quickly can that information move? That has strong effects on the kinds of prices that buyers are going to be willing to pay when they purchase coffee beans in Harare. Any questions? Harvey wrote this book at about the time that this book came out in the early stages of the U.S. occupation of Iraq. And he uses Iraq to illustrate what neoliberalism means on the ground, so to speak, what actual policy provisions define neoliberalism. And he draws on the plan that Paul Bremer, who for a time was in charge of the occupation, the plan that Bremer took to Baghdad and announced as the new rules of the game for Iraq. He says this included the full privatization of public enterprises, full ownership rights by foreign firms of Iraqi businesses, full repatriation of foreign profits, the opening of Iraq's banks to foreign control, national treatment for foreign companies, and the elimination of nearly all trade barriers. So, I mean, this didn't get talked about that much during the invasion or the early stages of the occupation. I mean, most of what we heard on the news had to do with, how was the military doing in taking different cities and what were the conditions on the ground as far as the troops and things like that. But Bremer actually showed up and said these are the new rules. And they had very much to do with the conditions on which international capital would be able to operate in Iraq. So if there were Iraqi nationalized industries, such as, well, oil is the foremost example, but there were plenty of other examples of entire sectors of the economy that were dominated by a national company. Well, they were going to be sold off to private entities, and those private entities might come from anywhere. They could be foreign firms, and those foreign firms would be allowed to repatriate their profits, which is to say, whatever money they made in Iraq, they would be allowed to simply send back home to their headquarters. They were going to be treated, national treatment for foreign companies, they were going to be treated the same way that Iraqi companies would be treated under the law. There would not be different rules for foreign companies as opposed to domestic companies. There would be full ownership rights by foreign firms. In other words, your private property claims on the company you owned in Iraq would be utterly the same from the rules that you might experience at home or the rules that might get imposed on any Iraqi owner. So the idea here was to open up the investment climate or investment environment of Iraq to the rest of the world market. Capital flows would be essentially free and unhindered by the boundaries, the national boundaries of Iraq. Yeah. If there were an Iraqi public, if the Iraqi government, the Iraqi state, owned an industry, it would be privatized, which is to say it would be sold, and the buyer could be from anywhere. If the buyer were Iraqi, an Iraqi consortium or investment and interest, then they would own it and they would operate within Iraq, and no, those profits would stay with that firm and be treated just the same way as the profits of another firm would be treated. However, they would have to buy it in an open auction, so to speak, by the company from the Iraqi state in an open auction that other investors from other countries would be free to participate in as well. So in other words, the price of that firm would be determined by international markets. And if it were bought by a foreign firm, that foreign firm would be free to take its profits and repatriate them back to their home country. Does that make sense? Well, how many of you have been to Mexico and bought gasoline? Yes. What's the gas station called? Pemex. Pemex is it's petrol Mexico, translated in Spanish, but it's short for that. The Mexican government owns all the gas stations, and Pemex is the company, the state company that runs that sector of the economy. So that's an illustration of the kind of thing we might be talking about, is a nationalized industry. He says the orders were to apply to all areas of the economy, including public services, the media, manufacturing, services, transportation, finance, and construction. Only oil was exempt. The labor market, on the other hand, was to be strictly regulated. Strikes were effectively forbidden in key sectors, and the right to unionize restricted. Perhaps my example is a poor one. In many parts of the world, including Iraq, the media is also a state-owned enterprise, right? The BBC in the United Kingdom is an example of this. In many countries, all of the media outlets are or were owned by the government. And so these were the kinds of companies that were to be privatized. Oil was exempt precisely for the reasons of history that you find when you read the Khalidi chapter, right? The idea of simply stripping the oil sector from Iraqi control would have been politically impossible and was to that extent treated differently. Harvey's point here is to emphasize the disparity between the treatment of the ownership of capital, which was to be privatized and deregulated, versus relations with labor, which were to be brought under a kind of strict regulation that is anything but a kind of free market. Where does neoliberalism come from? He says it's a response to political and economic shocks in the 1970s. And here, there is an interesting alignment, temporal alignment, between neoliberalism as a political philosophy or economic philosophy and globalization with its technological basis or emphasis, right? There was a clear political threat, Harvey says, to economic elites and ruling classes everywhere. But beyond this, the economic threat to the position of ruling elites and classes was now becoming palpable. Now, I suppose there aren't that many people in the room who were alive in the 1970s, huh? Just me? Yikes. Anyone else? Okay, David. All right, there's at least one other person. What do you associate with the 1970s in your memories of them? To the extent, well, your notions of what it was like in the 1970s. Any thoughts? Yeah. Okay, there was an oil crisis. That's a very important event from the 70s. Anybody have any images they associate with that? Yeah? How about you? Something else? Long lines at gas stations. Excuse me? Stagflation. And how many of you are familiar with that term? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What does stagflation refer to? It refers to something that was previously considered impossible, but which happened in the 1970s. It was a combination of high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. And I won't go into the macroeconomic theory, but previous to that point, it was believed that these two things would not happen at the same time, that they would counterbalance each other. That if unemployment went up, inflation would go down. The simple reason being that wages would go down, and spending by consumers would go down, and prices would have to come down because there would be less demand in the marketplace for goods. Well, the 1970s witnessed a period of both very high inflation and very high unemployment at the same time. And this threw the economists back on their heels and forced them to try to reevaluate the macroeconomics of the world market, well, national economies as well. And in fact, this had a lot to do with sort of the opening that Milton Friedman and his economics stepped into because they had a way of trying to explain this that others did not. What else? And those are not actually the kinds of things that Harvey is trying to get to here. The economic threat, yes, stagflation was part of that. But the political threat, what's the political threat to ruling elites in the 1970s? And perhaps the 1960s are a better period in which to try to summon these memories. What was going on in the United States in the 1960s? Come on, we're at Berkeley. We've got to have some answers to these questions, please. Okay, revolutions, or at least talk about revolutions. Massive movements of students and workers. The civil rights movement. The student social democrat, Democratic Socialists of America, that kind of thing, right? Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. There were widespread talk, not just in the United States, but in other places as well. I mean, the students in Paris, along with a lot of workers, took over Paris for the better part of a couple months in 1968, demanding radical change in education, in the economy, in the government. There was a sense that labor unions, student organizations, minority groups were mobilized and active and demanding change, and in many cases demanding change that they themselves described as revolution that would potentially threaten the established interests, be they white people, be they rich people, be they corporations, be they political parties. These are the kinds of threats that Harvey is suggesting were looming large in the minds of the establishment, elites, people sitting on boards of corporations, people sitting in political offices. They were scared. And there were economic threats, and Harvey provides a variety of ways of illustrating this. So here's figure 1.1, the economic crisis of the 1970s, inflation and unemployment in the US and Europe, 1960 to 1987. Inflation rate here, unemployment rate here. Europe is the dots, the US is the solid line, and you can see a spike in the inflation rate up to 8% in the US, up to almost 12% in Europe, coinciding with a spike in unemployment. Unemployment continuing to rise even as inflation was also up. And again, by the end, you see that the two have diverged again. Inflation has dropped, unemployment has not. So the previous relationship has been restored, but for a period of time there in the 70s, they were behaving oddly. Figure 1.2, the wealth crash of the 1970s. Share of assets held by the top 1% of the US population, 1922 to 1998. So you take the richest 1% of the population of the US, and you ask, what proportion of the wealth in the nation as a whole do these people own? And you can see that in the 1920s, it was better than 40%. It climbed to almost 50%, and then it began a decline. And it declined significantly during World War II. It went back up somewhat, and then it plummeted to 25% or less in the 1970s. How does this kind of thing happen? How could it be that the richest 1% have lost half of their wealth relative to the nation as a whole between 1930 and 1975? What does it take to redistribute wealth like that? Any ideas? Yeah. Inflation is one way to do it. Inflation is definitely one way to do it. Why? If you have $10 million in the bank, why is inflation a bad thing? Yeah. It devalues what you have. Right? The definition of inflation is that prices go up. The other way of expressing that, another way of saying the same thing, is that the value of your money goes down. What you can buy with your money declines. If inflation is high, your $10 million in the bank is essentially losing its value with every passing day. It will buy less and less and less and less. Unless you have interest rates that go up. Yes? Everyone's money becomes less valued. Exactly. Inflation is bad if you have $10 million in the bank. Inflation is even worse if you only have $10,000 in the bank. So wouldn't that not change the relative share of different people? You're right. It doesn't. So what else has to happen? How else might this have happened? Yeah. Unions. Unions could have an effect on this by demanding higher wages for workers, which might reduce profits for companies, and in turn reduce things like dividends for the people who own shares in those companies. That's one way it can happen, yes? Taxes. There you go. That's one really effective way to redistribute wealth, right? You can tax income. What were the income tax rates on the wealthiest 1% of the country after the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration? Anybody know? What was the very highest income tax bracket in the United States, beginning roughly here and continuing until roughly here? Anybody know? Yeah. 90%. If you were in the top income bracket, 90% of what you made went back to the federal government as income tax. What's the top rate now? Anybody know? 36. I think that's right. It might be 32, but it's in that ballpark. It's much lower than it was. Estate taxes are another example, right? Estate taxes go straight at wealth rather than just income. You die, you have $10 million in the bank. Can you just give it to your children? Or do you have to pay some taxes first? Well, if there is a high estate tax rate, and it is actually still, I think it's 55% for the largest estates. So you might give half or more of your estate to the government before you can give the rest to your children. These are some of the policies that made this change happen.